I thought it would be helpful to give a little background on myself and some of my experience, because I figure that'll probably provoke a bunch of questions. So wanted to dive in and give a little bit of my background and my history. I actually started out as an engineer. My first job was actually in Japan, working at IBM. That's where, at the time, that's where all the ThinkPads were actually designed. So I was a mechanical engineer designing laptops. Started out there. And then after that, I moved on to Sony, worked on a bunch of products at Sony, a bunch of laptops, accessories, and other things like that. I did that still in Japan. And then I was lucky enough, while I was still at Sony, one day they came to me with a project and they're like, Chris, we really want to do this product that is targeting business laptops, which I had some experience at IBM with that, and just for the US market. Well, being the only American in the group, I kind of had a little bit of an advantage there. So they came to me and I started giving them inputs on the actual product, not just the design of the product, but the actual product itself. And then that led to a conversation about moving into product management while I was still at Sony. So I ended up doing that, and that kind of kicked off my experience in product. And initially I was still at Sony in Japan, and I did this first ever living room PC that they did. I was working on that product as a product manager. And then I moved to the US while I was still at Sony. So I lived in San Diego for a little while. And then after Sony, I moved on to, after a big company, my own startup. I was like, I'm done with that. I want to do my own thing. I got really inspired, by that space, the TV space. Moved up to the Bay Area and said, okay, I'm going to do a startup. I did both hardware and software. And so one of the things that I've always done throughout my career has actually been product and product management, both with hardware and software. And I love the fact that I can look at the holistic experience between hardware and software together, not just one piece of that. And so even with my startup and even with this product before that, it was both. I was managing the software that ran on the device. I was managing all the hardware as well. As many startups go, they're not always successful. And so I did that for a while, for 3 years. Ended up exiting that. Didn't quite go as planned, but it's all right. I moved on. And I felt a little bit of retribution because I felt like I actually shipped the product that I really wanted to ship before at Amazon. I got to Amazon and I built the first Fire TV and the Fire TV stick. And so I was managing all the hardware, and I was also very involved in the software. And so I did that for that first initial launch of that product. And then after I did that, someone came to me and said, hey, Chris, we're really interested in getting into software at GoPro, and we would love to have you come help us do that and build a team around all these new software ideas and concepts and things like that. And I was like, wow, that's super exciting. GoPro at the time, this is pre-IPO, they're just taking off. I'm like, wow, this is going to be great. I didn't really want to leave Amazon at the time, but I was like, this opportunity is like too good to pass up. So I jumped in head first, and it was a lot of work. We were working on way too much at the time. We did all new mobile apps, all new desktop. We did stuff for the TV on Xbox and Roku and a bunch of platforms. We built a whole new cloud service that we launched, so you can sync straight from the GoPro to the cloud. Lots of stuff. I actually managed a very large team of product managers at that point that were managing each one of those individual projects. I wasn't involved in the hardware side of that, but I was very closely tied to everything that the hardware team was doing. I was constantly in conversations with them, so I still felt like I was involved in both, very much so. After that, I decided to do another startup. I've always enjoyed doing something new from the ground up. So I joined a startup, and that was actually around the smart home space. That was kind of short-lived. We were actually trying to turn your house into one giant sensor. And so anywhere in the house, we kind of knew what was going on. And so it was, again, very much a software, hardware play, and was very experienced, because most of the experience was actually not through your phone or through that, it was actually the house itself. So we dove into that, but things didn't quite work out the way we wanted. So now I'm at a startup, and we're doing robots delivery service. And so I get to play with robots all day long, which is super fun. it's not just hardware, but there's a lot of software that we have to do on the back end, and it's actually a lot of new stuff for me, but it's super exciting to lead product. So I'm actually leading the product endeavor there as well. So I'll leave it at that, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Can you give us a quick overview or explanation of like what a product manager, for someone who doesn't really have a lot of exposure to that, like what does that entail?
Well, yeah, so sure. I mean, from my perspective, there's lots of ways I think people describe what the role of a product manager is, and it's actually very different depending on what company you're at. You know, at Microsoft, I have lots of friends who've worked at Microsoft. Microsoft calls them program managers, but they're really a mix of program and product. You know, some people are more like project managers, you know, and some people are more focused on the user experience side. You know, if it's all purely software, you know, the roles vary from company to company, and at a startup, you do everything. But I like to think of the product manager as someone who's really the voice of the customer, because if you're really focused, if it's a B2C especially, and most of my experience has really been around B2C products, although our robot service, delivery service is a B2B play. It's the first time I've actually ever done true B2B. But most of mine have been, you know, B2C kind of products and consumer-facing products. And so I really think of, like, you know, the customer all the time. And you know, how do we translate the needs, you know, the problems, the pain points that the customer has into something that is actually solving those problems and those pain points. And I think that, and then from there, you have to understand those very, very well. You know, and I actually try to put myself always in the shoes of whatever customer, you know, that we're going for. And then you have to communicate that back internally to everybody. You know, both up to management and help them understand what it is, all the way down to engineering and everybody on the team. And I feel like you spend a lot of your time communicating, you know, and it's that's a big part of, I think, a product manager's job. I mean, yes, in some cases, if it's software and agile, you're doing, you know, features and putting it in Jira or something like that. But in a lot, I think really at the end of the day, it's about communicating and telling a story. You know, being at GoPro, we used to refer to it as storytelling all the time, because you have to communicate and tell that story, convince everybody that that's the thing that we're trying to go after. And you spend so much time doing that over and over and over again, because you're doing it, convincing all the engineers that that's the thing you're doing, convincing management that's the thing we're doing, you know, convincing everybody involved, UX and every aspect. And so you're touching all of those, and I feel like I never stop talking about what it is that we're trying to solve for, what it is that we're trying to do, and it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. And when you have hardware products and software, you're doing it with software teams, you're doing it with hardware teams, you're doing it with industrial engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, firmware engineers. Like, the teams get bigger and bigger, you know, and you spend a lot of time, you know, doing that more than anything. And to compare, like at GoPro, we actually literally did do storytelling. We would videotape stuff and turn that into the thing we're trying to solve and demonstrate that with video. At Amazon, PowerPoint is banned. I mean, literally, if you walk into a meeting and you try to ever show a PowerPoint, I think Jeff Bezos fired someone once for doing that. And there, it's all written communication, so you get very good at writing. So every company has its own way of doing things. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Gayatri. I'm a hardware engineer in Xilinx. So my question is regarding a transition between engineering and product. I can see that you did that yourself. You got a chance to lead a team, become a product manager, and you just moved to product. But in case of people who don't get a chance and who have to look out for a chance, I have heard that there are quite a few options. First try internally, then try networking and stuff. So when I tried to move internally, the things that I got said were, what is the credibility that you have so that we can offer you a product position from engineering? You were an engineer for 4 years and suddenly you want to become a product manager. What do you show something, prove something that you can do something in product line? So how do you approach that kind of a situation?
I mean, I think one opportunity is very much like what I had the opportunity to do is be, become really good friends with the product manager that you're whatever project it is that you're a part of, and really, try to see if your input is valuable and work with them much more closely, and hopefully they'll see the value that you're adding there in a way that they're like, wait, maybe there is something for you to add, especially if you have the education and the background and the understanding of product management and how things work. You can talk about it in a way that they could see that as being helpful. I think there, in that sense, there's an opportunity, and I just got lucky just because they're like, hey, you're the only American. But I think in a lot of ways it is that. It's like you see an opportunity, to help out in areas where maybe, because product managers are super busy, and we're always looking for help. I mean, I always take input from engineers when I work with people. I'm like, hey, you have an idea for this? It's like, because especially if it's something that they understand or they feel like they can contribute, and then if I feel like they do a great job, I mean, there is opportunities. And I've had engineers come to me, at different companies and say, hey, I'd really love to get in product management. How can I do that? Well, like help, contribute in ways that, are helping the product managers out. And then there's an opportunity maybe to shift over time. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not like after one project you're like, wow, that was amazing. Let's move you over into product management. I think it's going to take time. But if you continue to do that, I think it'll help. I wouldn't say I didn't have any experience, because while I was in grad school, I actually took business courses, before I even went to Japan. I went to grad school at MIT, and they let you take courses at the Sloan School. And so I always had an interest in business, and so I'm like, let me just take as many of those courses, because it was like, hey, you can just take these. And so I did that, because I was always interested in doing that. And it was kind of a free way of getting business school education without having to pay for it. And so I did that, but then when I went to Japan, I was still starting out as an engineer, but I always had an interest in doing that. And so when they brought me into that project and started getting my input, the first thing I would do is look at the market, look at, understanding like what the market needs are and things like that. It was just, I understood the process. So once I did transition into product management, I started reading like crazy. I got as many books as I could just to understand, all aspects of being a product manager. And I used that because I really didn't have access to schools like this or those types of, internally, especially being, you're in a team of other product managers, and they're always giving you feedback and guidance and input, whether you don't always maybe agree with it, but, you're always getting that, that as well. And I think that, that you learn from that, right? And so the team actually in Japan, because most of the product decisions for Sony are all made in Japan. And so being there amongst like probably 30 other product managers, you have input from lots of different people.
What was the costliest mistake?
The classic mistake?
Costliest.
The costliest. There was, so to use Sony as an example, because there was some good ones there. Sony is a very engineering-driven company, ironically. And I think that's been their downfall. But because they would let the engineers do things with the product that made zero sense to me. It was literally for themselves. And one of them was like, hey, Chris, my product that I was working on, they're like, hey, we want to put this custom chip that does special audio that, I'm like, who's going to use this? It's like, the chip cost it was a custom chip that Sony made, so it cost $2 million just for the R&D around the chip. And then on top of that, they had to produce the chip and all that. And then when you actually launched the product, no one used it. And it wasn't until probably years later when the guy who ran the whole team, because I told him I was against the idea from the beginning. It wasn't until he came actually to the U.S. to run some project in the U.S., he admitted to me, he's like, Chris, you were right. Oh, I've made lots of bad decisions, because everybody wants to think they know better than the customer at times. And when you do that, I think you hurt yourself, and I've done that. Some of it is just you never have perfect clarity into, no matter how much market data you gather, how much you go and do research with users, you never have perfect clarity. You're always going to make those kind of mistakes. I think spending as much time as you can and with the customers is the best way. I actually I'm not a huge fan of just straight up surveys and collecting data and things like that. I believe that you've got to spend as much time with the actual customers, the people who will use your products. I myself, before we even launched a robot, I've gone out and done deliveries for every company out there, just to understand how the whole process works. You have to, you really have to intimately understand how interacting with humans, because the robots don't interact with humans. We have to understand how that works.
Does the product manager play the role of a strategist? And follow on your time during GoPro when you were building all these products, were you working with a strategist, and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of companies they do, especially if you're, I mean, there's different phases of a product, right? You know, brand new products, and then you launch the product, and then it goes into more of a sustaining aspect. And if you're managing the sustaining aspect of a product, it's very different thinking about how you go about do that. I think when you're at the very beginning, it very much is strategy, right? You're thinking about the long-term vision, what's the strategy for the company, how does it fit into the other products the company might have. And so I think in that case, yes, you very much are a strategist. Sometimes some companies will have someone who's dedicated to that. I've actually never really worked at companies like that. Most of them have been small enough where the product manager or someone in product is taking on that role, or it's the CEO. In the case of GoPro, it's the CEO. I mean, Nick was like all over that. So.
One more, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you please describe your one simple working day, usual working day?
Sure. I mean, so. I mean, it's different at different places. It's been, very different. I can describe where, like at startups, it's in the morning we have stand-ups. I have multiple stand-ups. I have a hardware stand-up. We have a software stand-up. We're talking about, what you're doing, what happened before, what's happening today, and then in the beginning, that's in the beginning of the day, and then later on we're talking about, strategy, especially at a startup. We're like, hey, where are we going to go? How we're still raising money, all kinds of things like that. And then, I'm helping out engineers. They'll have questions, because they're like, hey, Chris, what do you want to do with this? This came up, how we solve that problem. It's constant, like, feedback, loops. And then in some cases, I'll be going out trying to talk to customers or, talk with partners or vendors or get feedback and understand more about the product or more about what we need to do, the product to do. And different days are different, but it's a constant loop of those kinds of things.
How you measure your success? In a sense, second software you can measure it in kind of incremental release, but with the hardware, how you like with IBM and Sony, it's like some of them.
Yeah, yeah, it's very different between hardware and software. Software, the thing I love about software is you can measure it, right? Like you can set very specific metrics that you can literally, like every little interaction you can measure and see how things are going, and you can see it much faster. Hardware, on the other hand, is much more challenging, in terms of metrics. To be honest, the way most companies that do hardware measure success is sales. It's like how many sales did we, how many units did we sell, and that is often a reflection of really the success of a product, but. The product, I've seen cases where you have tested the product with users, and every piece of feedback you get from users is that they love it, it's amazing, but the sales were terrible. And there's various reasons why that may have happened, because hardware is hard in the sense that it takes a lot of marketing, it takes being on the shelves in the right stores, it takes being in the right timing of the year. There's so many factors that come into play, which may impact the sales of the product. Doesn't mean the product itself sucks. To be clear, I did software here, I did software here. We built a whole cloud server. This aggregated every online service out on the internet, streaming live, like streaming service from all the different sites. Same thing here. Multiple partners in terms of software and software, cloud software. We were the first ones to use Alexa. We were like the precursor to Alexa, so we had a whole voice service that we had built for this, because the remote has a voice input on it. The team who was doing Alexa was in the next room, and then at GoPro I did software. So GoPro wasn't my first time doing software, just to be clear. And so getting to GoPro, I don't think it wasn't as challenging, but then as soon as I dove in, I think people, and one thing that was helpful, I took, because we used Agile along the way in a lot of these different places. At GoPro, just to help refresh, I did a full-on Agile product management course and training, and got certified in Agile and all that, just to help refresh, and help understand the way that the team works and operates. Things like that are helpful, so at least that way you understand the way the team operates. And it depends on the company that you're going to, how technical on the software side I think you need to be. In some places, at the end of the day, you're representing the customer. If your customers are very tech, like if you're building an API for engineers to use or something like that, that's a different thing than if you're building a mobile app for end users to use. And I think as a product manager working on a mobile app, you can really, you understand, you go out, you understand their customers, their needs, and stuff like that. You communicate that back. You don't have to be an expert in how it got coded. And I think as long as you're representing the customer to the engineers, that's what's most important. Being able to talk with them about what they're doing is helpful. But if the product is actually for engineers, then I think that's a different case. And I've never worked on those kind of products because I myself I'm not a coder. I'm not super in depth, but I've never had issues with talking to the type of engineers that I work with. Yeah, engineers come over to product management, and it's very hard for them to stay out of the how. Because immediately ideas pop into their head, and they're like, "Hey, we can do it this way," and you're like, "Whoa, hold on, is that even the right thing?" I think the better way if you are an engineer, is at least you can often, having worked with lots of engineers, they say, "Hey, let's do this," and you want to push them a little bit, because they're like, "Oh, that's too hard," or "That's difficult," or "That's too challenging." You always want to kind of push them, because that's where innovation comes from. There's constraints. How do you overcome those constraints? And I think part of the role of a product manager is to kind of push on them a little bit to get them past those, and not necessarily tell them how an idea or how it should be done, but like push back. They're like, "Oh, that's going to take this long. It's going to be too hard." And you're like, "Well, really? Like, have we thought of every possible solution for this, or is there another thing that we can look at? Like, is there ideas?" And you can get them thinking about it some more to push them. And I think as an engineer, you can do that, and you have somewhat credibility in doing that, because a lot of times when I've seen product people push back the engineer, like, "You don't know what you're talking about," It's like, and I'm a big believer in things like design thinking and those types of processes, lean startup type ways of doing things, and a lot of times you don't know what you don't know, and there's those external factors come into play in that case, right? You don't know what all the external factors are going to affect your product are until the first time it touches the market or that part of the space you're going after. And so, but before you go off and especially build something as complex as that, to find that out, there's lots of things that you can do to fake that, to understand what's going to happen when you put it out into the real world. And I've always been a big believer, especially in the case of hardware, because hardware is expensive, and the lead time to build the real thing is long. And so we always look for ways to get out and test as much as we can to learn what those factors are, because until you do that, you get out in the real world. Like when we finally took our robot out for the first time, we learned so much. It was like, oh my gosh, there's like all these things that we never anticipated, but the sooner you can learn that, the better. And so we constantly do that, and then you iterate again, you learn from it, you take it out again, you expose your ideas and whatever it is you're trying to do to the real world, and the sooner you can expose them, even if it's faked, the better.
Whenever you think about rolling out any product or product feature, there are a lot of details you have to consider, and it is easy to miss details. So do you follow any kind of checklist, or what are the factors you usually consider?
Yeah, I mean, the process, is in the case of hardware, anyone who's familiar with how hardware works, is usually a very well-defined process in terms of making sure you don't miss. And it's a waterfall process, whether people like it or not. It's very much that, or stage gate is how it's often referred to. And the reason for that is because at every step, every one of those steps along the way, there's a very detailed checklist. And that's been, created over many years of building hardware. And you always go through that to make sure that you've passed those steps. Now, in the case of software, I've seen lots of teams build things without a QA team, and and that's fine for just quickly prototyping and iterating and testing things. But a lot of times I've seen really bad software get out there because they don't follow some sort of checklist or even have a QA. And I think there are things you want to make sure that you do. And I think what I've learned is setting very clear, as a product manager, I think, because often it doesn't happen unless the product manager does it, setting very clear acceptance criteria that says the customer is really looking for the product to do X, Y, and Z. And if you don't test for those things, you'll just get some stuff built. And at the end, you're like, well, does it do those things that we wanted it to do? And no one can answer the question because there was no acceptance criteria of saying it was supposed to do this, and it was supposed to do this, and it was supposed to work this way because the customer is expecting it to be that way. And QA had no way to test that. There was no QA maybe. And I think it's really important that you do that. And often I don't see people doing that. And so you just get haphazard development. Yeah, I mean, I've seen the QA role it's very different at different companies. Like sometimes there's a whole team off by themselves and people throw it over the wall and they say, hey, test this, and then in other places I've seen QA actually be part of the Scrum team and they're actually part of the integrated process of constantly test, build, test, and going through that. And that works great if that's set up properly. Because then they're part of the team and they're part of the conversation with the product manager, they're part of the feature definition and part of the acceptance criteria. They understand it, everyone knows what we're building towards. That works great, I think. I don't think it works very well when people just throw it over the wall and then they test a whole bunch of stuff and says, none of this stuff works, send it all back. Because then QA is often isolated from even product, which is not good in my mind because they need to understand the product requirements. They need to understand what the user is looking for because they, in a lot of ways, also try to represent the user, right? They're like trying to play the user when they're going through testing and seeing what happens. So I think it's really important to bring them into the loop. Yeah.
So you've said that the product manager really needs to represent the customer. And in general, sales has the closest relationship with customers. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship of product management to sales?
So in my experience, and I'm just speaking to my experience with B2C, sales actually isn't the closest to the customer because sales is selling to Best Buy, as an example. The sales team is talking to Best Buy, they're talking to Fry's, they're talking to all the retailers, Walmart, whatever. They're not talking to the actual customer. Now, in the case of a B2B product, I think that is true. And the sales people are often the closest to that, talking to them about what their needs are and what they need and exactly how they want stuff built or something. And so I think you have to have a constant communication or even go with them to the meetings and stuff if you can. But in the B2C world, I feel like I've always had to go straight to the customer and talk with them, interview them. Actually, one of the best things that I love to do as progressing through product, and I did it at Sony, and I've done it at GoPro, and I've done it at a lot of other places. Sit on phone calls with customer support and feel the pain of your customers. I mean, I've sat on hour-long phone calls before. It's just so amazing what you learn just sitting. And so we would do that. We'd sit in on calls. We'd listen to all the feedback from actual customers about products and the challenges they have. That's actually one of the best ways to hear from your customers. Well, not for B2C again. I think in that case, CES is not in my opinion, that's never a representative of your customer base. Maybe in the case of again, B2B, there's big trade shows where you're talking to those people, and I think you can get valuable feedback if you have the right time to sit down and actually talk with them and understand. But for B2C, I always feel you have to go out. You have to understand the actual end users. Yeah.
So apart from the technical stuff, transitioning and learning about product, helping out product managers and stuff, what else can you do to pick up the skills of a product manager?
I mean, you can take courses like this. You can read, talk to other people. Just try to get involved. Is like I said, like the customer support example. Like, ask if you can sit on those kind of calls. Try to be part of that. Understanding of what's going on with your customers, and then you'll have ideas, right? You'll come back and you say, look, I've heard our customers say they need this, or they're having problems with this, or because a lot of times customer support or even QA people understand the pain points better than a lot of people, and you have to be able to be willing to listen to them on that and the feedback that they're getting. So I think there's lots of different areas and touch points. Talk with the UX people. Often UX and engineering work very close together. Usually UX are trying to, again, understand the customers and how to transfer those needs into something that is a visual representation or interaction, and those types of things. Talk with them. If they are doing interviews with customers or if they're doing testing, see if you can go. A lot of times we would invite our engineers. When we would do actual user testing, we wanted our engineers to hear firsthand the feedback from the customer. Because a lot of times you'll come back and you'll tell them, and they're like, no, really? We don't believe that. They never said that. So you're like, no, you're coming with us next time. Sit in on those, so you can hear directly from the customer. So ask to do those things. I am always a fan of doing less and making sure we do it right and getting that in front of the customer sooner and learning from that to see if they ask for other things as opposed to like, let's throw in a bunch of other stuff that they may never use. And so I think often the hardest job is saying no, for any product manager, but like you got to get good at that, because it's easy to say, yeah, let's do that, oh, this is cool, let's throw that in, and engineers will be like, yeah, I could totally do that overnight, yeah, boom, 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 and you're like, you hear that all the time, and then you're like, yeah, but who's gonna, debug that, who's gonna QA it, and who's gonna make sure this works, and that touches that, and so I'm always a fan of like the minimal amount, testing that, getting it out there, and making it really good, and making sure we've done the right thing. And so, it comes back to capacity too, in terms of what the team can pull off. Yeah.
You talked about how the product manager takes on the role of like project manager and program manager depending on the company. So how do you adapt when it's totally different at a different company, and you have instances where it wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, I try, unless you're interested in doing those roles or playing that role, I try to find that out before I choose to join a particular company. And that's why I either talk to people who work there, find out what it's really like, to be in that role as a product manager at that particular company. Because unless you're a fan of doing that, because I'm not a fan of being a program manager or project manager. And I would want to find out that before I join, some companies, because some of them are like that. The role can be very different, and you want to know what you're getting into, in any company you're joining like that. And so, I would look at that, and then if you're okay with it, then it's just a matter of learning how they do things, what tools they use, and are you comfortable with that?
As a new product manager, if you get an opportunity to join a new team or a new company, and there are no product management standards or processes, what are the top 3 things you would like to establish?
I mean, because a good example is where I am now. I kind of came in and there was no product people. It was all engineers, like PhD level engineers, right? And I like to start talking about maybe not from day one, but I like to start talking about how do we establish some sort of process, And I know that some often engineers don't like that word. Oh my God, it's gonna suck. But I think it actually helps in the end, And I think, getting people to understand having it doesn't have to be super, detailed and and all that, but getting something going. What is the process to making decisions about long goals? How do you work backwards from those goals to make sure we're hitting milestones? How do we set metrics? I think it's super important to start establishing the idea of setting metrics, because otherwise, how do we know we're hitting any target at all for anything? And starting to put those types of things in place, I think is super helpful. And if there's UX involved, working with, if you have a UX person, not always, but if you have a UX person, working with them to establish, like, getting ahead of engineering so that you're understanding the needs of the customer and translating that into something that engineering is, going to create visually or whatever the interaction may be. But getting that sort of process in place is super helpful. Roadmap, whether it's long-term or short-term. I mean, big companies love to talk about really long-term stuff, and startups are like, hey, what are we going to do next month? What's the next quarter? And probably not as long, but still it's helpful to have some kind of direction, where you're headed. I think those are the kinds of things that I like to talk about and put in place if we can.
You mentioned some of the books, so I can help you, can you share the name of the books?
Well, like I said, I've read a lot of the stuff around design thinking. I mean, there's multiple books around that. The Lean Startup stuff by Eric Rice. There's if you want to, I think this can work at any company. When I was at Homa, the startup there, for the first time I went through the Google design process, where that week-long kind of design sprint. That's a lot of fun. If anyone's never done that, read the book. I mean, and it lays it out exactly how to do that. But it's fun, to go through that. It's intense, because you compress a lot into 1 week. But it really forces you to go through a process that's similar to that. But those are the types of things that I started immediately reading. Back when I was at Sony, I picked up as much as I could. It was still the early days of that kind of stuff, but I was just trying to read up on as much of that as I could find. I mean, IDEO kind of kicked off a lot of that, and so I read a lot of stuff from them. So yeah. The question is, like, he mentioned the sprint book, and he said is it possible to come up with a prototype in a week? And so I was going to give an example. So at Homa we did the sprint, and it was a week, and so we were like, well, how do we prototype an experience of a whole home in a week? And so we actually rented an apartment building, like an apartment in a building, and we went in and literally were removing outlets and a bunch of stuff, and we put speakers and all kinds of stuff all over the house. We had and set the whole thing up. Our engineers coded as little as they could just to make stuff work. And when someone would come into the house, I literally had like tablets and phones that was controlling like 5 different systems, and as they were walking through, I was just kind of pushing buttons, and it was all fake. But we would prompt them with something, and then when they would do something, then I would do something else here. So it was kind of like the guy behind the curtain, like doing all this stuff. And then we put cameras everywhere to capture all of the interactions and stuff like that. It's possible. I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's possible. What was the purpose? The purpose of doing that. Yeah, absolutely. We got a ton of feedback from those people that went through that. Who was the person? We had a very specific segment of users in mind, and we went and recruited those users, and then we invited them over to go through the house, and we sat down with them. We talked to them about, like, hey, imagine you're about to buy this apartment, or because our proposition there was to not necessarily sell direct to users. It was actually we were working with builders, home builders, and so we wanted to know, like, if they were coming to look at a new house, would this influence their decision to buy? And we actually asked them how much they would pay for that apartment as if it was for sale. We actually made a fake ad as if that apartment was for sale. And we put a price tag on it. And we said, oh, these options with the smart home features were extra. We got their feedback on that after they went through it. Oh yeah, no, tons of feedback.
And they were willing to pay more?
Someone said they were willing to pay $50,000 more. I was shocked, but they were willing to pay $50,000 more for it. I was like, it was in Palo Alto. So, I mean, maybe that wasn't a big deal. They're like, oh yeah, Palo Alto, $50,000, no problem. But I mean, yeah, it was very useful. But it's not just getting the feedback from the users that's the point. Going through that exercise forces you to think about a lot of things as well that you wouldn't have probably thought about if you didn't try to compress that into a week. The cameras were there just for us to capture their interactions with the house. That wasn't something that was going to be part of the actual experience. Yeah.
Have you hired product managers at these big companies you've worked at, and what are some things that stand out when you look at their resumes and profiles?
Yeah, I built the team at GoPro. I came in, I was the only person there, and then I built the team up to 9 people after I got there, and some of them I brought from my previous companies. So sometimes it was easy, but other people you just had to go out and hire them. So you look at you're looking at resumes, and often I don't pay a ton of attention to resumes. I just look. I mean, if there's some amount of relevant experience, I look at that. But I actually do an exercise. I have them go through an exercise, and I give them an exercise. I send it to them ahead of time, and then I have them come in, present. Like in the case of GoPro, I said, we want to increase engagement with the mobile app by X. We want to have this aspect of the mobile app. We want to do acquisition, engagement, those types of things. Have them come in and present some idea, and then we actually walk through it as if you're going to create a sprint, with an engineering team. You're going to talk to UX people. We have UX people in the room. We have engineers in the room. And we do it as if they're really going to do it for real. And that'll weed out people almost immediately. Because, people will come in and they might have a really nice presentation. I'm like, great, why don't you write some features up on the board, and how would you, talk to the UX person about that? They're sitting right here. How would you do that? And people can't even do that. And I'm like, if you can't do that there, like, how can I expect you, to do that on a daily basis? Because that's the things you're going to have to do.
What are some of the tools do you use for various PM responsibilities on day-to-day?
I mean, it's been the full gamut. I mean, there's, I feel like on the software side we use Jira and Confluence all the time, but there's similar tools to those. There's lots of low-cost versions of those things that just manage, like, tasks and features and things like that. I've used various of those at startups and things, because sometimes you're just looking for a lower cost. So people have used Excel, to manage that kind of stuff. Not ideal, but I've seen people do it, for saving, like Google Docs, right? You save money that way. The tool like I said, at Amazon, everything was written. We actually wrote documents, so my main tool there was literally Word, and that was it. That's all we got to use mostly. Lots of writing. Most people, if you've never worked it, it's a process that is very strange, but I've actually found it to be, after you've been through it, you see the value. So you write a press release, and as if you had just launched the product. And you take that press release to Jeff Bezos, and you present it to him. He reads it. And it's, and then after reading it, he's like, has all these questions. And usually the press release is 1 page, and then there's like 50 pages of FAQ that you write ahead of time, because every question that someone's going to ask, and we try to anticipate every question he's going to ask, and you have the answer for it. And so you're like, oh, wait, that's page 10, go look at that, and that's the answer for that question. And if you don't have the answer, then you go back and you come back and do it again when you do have the answer. That's their process. And it's weird because you'll go through multiple meetings there, and you'll go into a meeting and everyone will read the document ahead of time. And I'm sure we've all been through this situation, because where I saw the value in this, how many have gone into a meeting, someone gets up, does a presentation, and everyone's sitting there on their phone, and hey, you're like, hey, I sent the presentation out to everybody. Do we all understand it? You get to page 2, and then everyone's like, hey, wait, what about this and this? And they ask all these questions. You never get past slide 2 or slide 3. And all this conversation goes around and around and around, because you're like, wait, no, that's on slide 4. Just hold on, And like, you've done that so many times. Whereas there, everyone reads the entire document. It takes 15 minutes maybe. And then afterwards, if there's any questions, they ask those questions. But everyone has literally, no laptops, no phones. Everyone reads the document. Everyone's on the same page. And if there's any questions, they ask them. If there's not, we're done. The meeting is literally done. I've been in where everyone reads and they're like, yep, looks good. Let's go. And, but instead of that, how many times do you go through those PowerPoint experiences? And I mean, it's strange, but I've seen it work. And I actually tried it once with Nick Woodman at GoPro, and it actually turned out really well. I was surprised. He's a very visual person, but it worked in that particular scenario. I actually like the press release process, because the whole point is, how can you fit a concept of a new product or a new release of a new feature or something like that into one page? And it forces you to limit what you talk about. What are the most important things that you were going to tell your customer that's going to convince them that that's the product they want to buy? And it really forces you to think about that up front. And it forces you narrow scope from the very beginning. I found that to be very useful. And then everyone can read that, and they're like, am I convinced? Would I go out and buy that just from that press release? And if not, go back and rewrite it. And I found that part of it to be useful. I'm not a fan of then writing all the massive amount of FAQ and requirements that come after that, but I found the press release, because it forces you to really focus and think about your product and have people read it and get their reaction to that. That actually, it's a lot of people don't like to write. It's easy to do PowerPoint and put 3 bullet points. And I think that's the reason why Jeff doesn't like it, is because it requires thinking to actually write a full page that's convincing. Yeah.
3 most important lessons learned from your experience in GoPro.
At GoPro? Don't try to do too much. I mean, I think this is true of regardless of the size of the company. Don't try to take on too much focus. I think the other big one I learned is you really got to understand the capabilities of the team you're working with. Because sometimes if you give them a task that is just well beyond, or you give them a product that's just well beyond their capabilities, that you're going to hurt yourself in the end. Third one, I think, and this is maybe true not just of GoPro, but you can never over-communicate enough, or communicate enough the vision, the direction, the thing that you're trying to drive towards as far as the product goes. Sometimes you think, man, I've told people 10 times or 100 times. It often is never enough, because people get sidetracked and busy. And this also comes from when you're trying to do too much, people really get sidetracked and busy. And you really got to constantly remind them, why are we doing this? Why is this important? What are we doing? What's the vision? And I feel like you can never say that enough. Because you got to have everyone on the same page.
Do you think that some basic user experience design skills or feature design skills is necessary for product manager, especially for mobile applications?
I don't think it's absolutely necessary. It definitely helps. I mean, to have a sort of a design sense, I think it's helpful to be able to tell the difference between a good design and a bad design as a product manager, because often you are the one that has to somewhat judge that. Do you like certain things a certain way or not? I mean, but you don't have to be I don't think you have to be an UX expert or a UI expert or any of that. But I think it definitely helps to have a design sense, because you have to look at what comes out of the product, and you're like, is this something I would use, or do I like it? Am I delighted? Am I excited about the user experience? I mean, you have to be able to give that feedback, and so having a good sense of that, I think, is important. You never, in the case of Sony, when we were working on laptops, I mean, it was very competitive. There's so many other companies working on laptops, and you try to anticipate where the market's going and understand what's coming, but you never know for sure. But again, this is where I believe that if you focus on what's really important to your customers, I'm not a fan of, and this often is the trap that the hardware companies fall into, is chasing speeds and I often refer to as speeds and feeds. Qualcomm or whoever comes to you, we got the next chip. It's going to be this much faster and it's going to do this much more. And so you just accept that and you do the same thing as everyone else. And you just kind of ignore what customers really care about, and you just do what the chip companies, or I mean, at Sony it was Intel, like, oh, we got the next chip, we got to do this. But it's like, well, what do our customers really care about? And I believe that if you focus on that more than anything, and I think that's where Apple started to win, is because they focus on what's really important to their customers. I mean, I think it's changed, now, but in the early days, that's what I think helped them get ahead of everybody else. You focus on what's important as opposed to talking about chips and how fast this is or that is and how many megapixels, all that stuff. It's just, I mean, GoPro fell into the same trap. Oh, now it does 4K. Well, now it's 4K 60. Now it's 4K 120. Now it's, we actually talked to all our customers. No one cared. They're like, 4K, what does that do for me? How do I do anything with that? Actually, we created a problem for them because that file is so huge, they move it onto their 3-year-old laptop and they can't do anything with it. They're like, but that was the best quality. But now I can't even edit that video, or I can't even share it because it's so big. But they didn't know that. They're just like, I wanted to shoot in the best quality. But so you got to be careful about just chasing the, that sort of trend and really focus on what the customer cares about.
So there are so many problems to solve. How do you pick and choose the problems you want to solve? Like, what is your criteria? Like, especially with your startup. So, like, why did you choose these domains, or was it your familiarity to that? Or
well, I mean, there's, in this case of the startup, why I went there is different than why at a particular company we choose to solve certain problems or go after certain problems. Again, I think it starts, you go back to the customer. What is their biggest pain point? What is the thing that, and this is actually, and I've advised startups before as well, and this is, you talk to a lot of these guys and they're like, I have this really amazing idea. And I'm like, well, have you tested that with customers? Have you asked them to pay? Because if you have an idea and you talk to people about it, they're like, wow, that's super cool. And I'm like, well, can you take your credit card out and pay for that? All of a sudden, everything changes. If the pain point is so high that someone's like, I will pay you now to solve this problem, that's where you start. I mean, it's painful enough that that's the place you want to start with. In the case of the robotics company, everybody who delivers today is losing money. DoorDash, Postmates, all these guys lose money. So they're like desperate to have something that is way cheaper than paying a person to deliver your food on demand. For them, it's a massive pain point. And so you look at that and you're like, wow, there's a huge opportunity there, right? It's not an easy problem to solve, but once you do solve it, there's huge opportunity because everybody's desperate for it.
Hey, really quick, let's give him a hand.